Down in a Grave, written and performed by Tony Capobianco. A brooding Castabello sat shotgun as his partner, Marsh, drove the SUV. The tall trees blurred by as they drove to the next case. They had good reason to believe that a group of vampires had nested in a graveyard in the Hudson Valley. "Cono, it's been a while since you've been in the field. How do you feel?" asked Lydia as she glanced away from the road to look at her friend. The two friends and partners often addressed each other by their first names in private. Feel? How do I feel? What do feelings have to do with the case at hand? What you really want to know is whether I'm ready for duty or if I'm going to get you killed, Cono apathetically answered. No, I trust you with my life. I just want to know how you are. I know you've gone through a lot, and it's okay to not be okay. Sometimes it's good to talk about stuff, especially heavy stuff, Lydia said softly and tenderly. Trusting me with your life is a good way to get killed. Ask Agents Torres, Kipling, Fairchild, and Jones. Oh wait, you can't ask them because they're dead, Cono replied sardonically as he emptily stared out the window. Doubt swirled around Special Agent Cono Castabello's mind like dirty water circling the drain. Sorrow bred waves of depression, which in turn generated a storm surge of despair. Anger, frustration, guilt, and self-loathing inundated his soul. The weight was heavy and unbearable. The totality of his defeat at Bat Cave had broken him. The Master had thrashed him so severely that he had been at death's door. Good FBI agents were lost that day. The Master and his vampire minions had killed them in a truly horrific manner. Cono felt responsible for the whole disaster. The gruesome images and sounds from that day had been seared into his memory. Although the Master hadn't succeeded in killing Cono, he certainly had left his mark. It was as if he had branded him with evil. The typically calm, self-assured, optimistic, and witty Castabello was now anxious, self-doubting, pessimistic, and somber. This melancholy state of mind was quite alien to him. As an FBI agent, he knew that his current mental state was unacceptable for field work. He recognized that going out into the field in such a chaotic state would make him a danger to himself, to his partner, to his team, and potentially to civilians. In the line of duty, hesitation and doubt can be the difference between life and death. Even a tiny, momentary hesitation could cost him his life or the life of another agent. Law enforcement officers often speak of gut instincts and having a hunch. Cono had reasoned that instincts and hunches were the product of years of studying, on-the-job experience, and keen observation. For him, gut instinct was the result of the subconscious mind's lightning-fast processing of subtle clues and observations that the conscious mind wasn't aware of. Subtle details of someone's body language or tone of voice can give an investigator information that would normally go unnoticed without training and experience. Cono surmised that the mind analyzes such details even when the person isn't aware of it, and that the results of the silent processing manifests in the form of a gut instinct or a hunch. The human brain is a fascinating organ, and when it comes to understanding it, science is only in its infancy. Cono was so riddled with doubt that he even questioned his former understanding of the origins of hunches. The maddening cacophony of confusion was not without reason. Over the past year, a veil had been lifted and a whole new world had been revealed to him. Not only had he glimpsed a previously unseen reality, but he had been thrust right into the middle of it. He had always been a practical and rational person. He never attributed to the supernatural or superstition what could be attributed to the natural. Then he encountered Tut, the undead terror serial killer. Lydia Marsh, Moon Mist Division, a secret portal to another world, vampires, and the story of the Kaibo. From that point on, everything changed forever. Once certain things are seen, they can't be unseen. Coming to know that supernatural and preternatural things are irrefutably true means that the genie can't be put back in the bottle. After the threshold to the door of the paranormal has been crossed, there is no going back. Cono had never been an atheist. All of his life he had been skeptical without being a bona fide skeptic. After all, he had been named after Saint Cono, a Catholic saint. Saint Cono is a lesser-known saint that is the patron saint of a small town in Italy where his Italian ancestors were from. Having been baptized and raised Catholic from birth, he had always lived in a mysterious world. His world was a world with God, angels, demons, ghosts, and miracles. While he believed in the reality of such extraordinary things, he compartmentalized those beliefs. To his mind, those things had more to do with theology and faith than they did with everyday experience. He had never seen a ghost, an angel, or a demon, and he never expected that he would ever see such spirits. In a sense, he perceived two separate worlds. One was the real, everyday world in which everyone lived, and the other was the world of faith. These worlds weren't opposed to one another, but they were distinct. He thought of these worlds as essentially being two real places that often operated in the same space, but in different dimensions. That was a worldview that had served him well for nearly 3 decades. Then he crossed the threshold to the world of the paranormal, and the lifting of the veil blew up his understanding of the world. In a short span of time, he had been forced to face a new and true super-reality. This jarring new reality included the existence of immortal vampires, witches, magic, and mystical portals to other worlds. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, he learned that there was an ancient lineage of psychically powerful vampire hunters, and he was part of that exalted dynasty. Cono hadn't had the time to sufficiently wrestle with the implications of this new reality. Learning about vampires, the Moon Mist Division, and training in the ways of the Kaibo had eaten much of his time, and hunting vampires had eaten the remainder of his time. There was always another mission to go on. There was always another case to investigate. The past year had been a hectic whirlwind that had sucked him in completely. There had not been an opportunity to absorb the new facts, to contemplate the big picture, or to reshape a new workable lens through which to see the world. He had been so busy doing rather than thinking that these life-changing truths had been swept into a mental closet and left to sort out for some other day. That day didn't arrive until the aftermath of the Bat Cave incident. He hadn't chosen the day to address the ramifications of his strange new life. No, the day of reckoning had been forced upon him by fate. The spectacular defeat and humiliation that Cono suffered at the hands of the Master thrusted him into a terrible internal war. He was at war with himself. He questioned himself. He questioned his choices. He questioned his purpose. He questioned everything. As his body recuperated from the grave wounds inflicted on it by the ancient evil vampire, his mind waged an invisible battle. Unseen wounds often leave the deepest scars. Cono, Earth to Cono, this is ground control calling. Cono, are you there? Lydia asked as she waved her hand in front of his face. Yeah, I'm here, distantly replied Kono. You know, it's not your fault that those agents lost their lives. The Master and his demonic minions are at fault, Lydia assured him. Did the Master give the order to search Bat Cave? Was it the Master who had the trust of those agents? Kono asked as a sadness seeped into his voice. We made that decision to investigate the cave together. Director Glover signed off on the mission as well. As for trust, we are a team. We all trust each other. Unlike that filthy vampire lord, we make the choice to trust, whereas he compels his slaves to obey, Lydia responded. Well, then you had better rethink your choices. I'm not who or what you think I am. Everybody thinks that I'm some kind of superhero, but I'm not. I can't even save myself. Why should you think that I could save anyone else? Castabello questioned in an emotionless voice. Newsflash, you've only been aware of your Kaibo abilities for a little over a year. The amount of abilities that you have worked hard to use in so short a period of time is actually quite remarkable. That being said, there is so much more for you to learn. You will grow in your skills. Stop thinking that you have to be Superman. You have already saved lives. Without you, Adam would still be a prisoner of that fiend, said Lydia as she drove in the cold rain. Because of my weakness, you nearly became vampire food. That ancient evil scumbag nearly drank me dry. When I close my eyes, I could feel the painful sting of his bite, and I can smell his foul odor. Maybe, if I hadn't been so full of myself, people wouldn't have been killed, said Kono as he seemed to look beyond the road in front of them. In this life, everyone's safety is uncertain, and in this line of work, safety is even less certain, said Lydia. I don't know if I should be going with you to clean out the suspected vampire nest. I'm a mess right now. I know how important confidence is in field work. I have to be honest with you, Lydia. I don't trust myself. I'm not sure of who I am, and I'm afraid that I might hesitate when we're out there. An FBI agent cannot hesitate, and a Moon Mist agent absolutely can't hesitate. If I hesitate when a vampire's attacking, I might cost you your life, and I couldn't live with that. Frankly, I think I'm a liability out there, said Kono with an emptiness in his eyes. Stop it. Look here. Even if you're not at 100%, even if you're at 50%, that's better than most agents are at 100%. You aren't the only one who's been fighting with himself. It hasn't exactly been easy for me either. You don't have a monopoly on dealing with crap, Lydia replied. Oh, Lydia, the perfect one, is having a tough time, so I should just hit the magic reset button and get back to normal, right? What's a tough time for you anyway? Not closing every case in front of you? You're always annoyingly perfect and have it all together. Maybe you should just shut up about this, because you don't know what it's like to fall apart, said Kono in frustration. I've had a really miserable past few months. I've been second-guessing the decisions that we made that awful day. Then, that evil bastard turned my old high school boyfriend and sent him to kill me in my own home. If all that wasn't bad enough, the mall death stalker has broken out of prison. He was the serial killer that stalked and assaulted me when I was in college. All of that has triggered some serious crap. I've been an anxiety-laden mess. You've been too focused on your pity party to see it, but I've been in a perpetual state of fight or flight. I'm doing my best to keep it together, but it's exhausting, and it's taking all of my strength, Lydia said as her frustration finally boiled over. Look, Lydia, I'm sorry. I was out of line. I had no right to say those things. When I'm hurting, I have a bad habit of lashing out at anyone near me. You were right. I have been selfish lately. I had no idea that you've been suffering so much. What a fine pair we are, huh? Replied Cono with a half smile. Although Cono didn't realize it, he had subconsciously picked up on subtleties in Lydia's behavior, and his mind had perceived her suffering. Somewhere in the deep hidden places of his mind was an anger that raged upon seeing a reflection of his own weakness and pain in his partner. Seeing what we hate about ourselves in others is often the cause of sudden anger. As mentally banged up as they were, they had to drive forward. There was too much at stake. Crawling up into a defensive ball wasn't an option. Besides, even if they did retreat and hide, they wouldn't be safe. The master had targeted them, and they were very much in his crosshairs. They could run, but they couldn't hide. Someone had to face this vampire plague, and if not them, then who? The rain became heavier as they reached the cemetery in Middletown, New York. The sun was still up, and they searched the cemetery exactly as they had planned. They were not going to repeat the mistakes that they had made at Bat Cave. They searched the above-ground crypts for resting vampires. One by one, Castabello and Marsh entered and began to clear each of the crypts. Lydia and Cono shined their flashlights into the dark crypt. Silently, they both experienced flashbacks to the horrors of Bat Cave. Each footstep that they took in their muddy shoes made an eerie squeaking sound that echoed off of the concrete walls. Every step that Castabello took startled Marsh. She was on edge, and her heart beat like a drum. As anxious as she was, her training took over just enough for her to focus on the moment at hand. In fact, she used her anxiety and fear as a tool that gave her sharper perception. The adrenaline allowed her to see and hear more clearly wherever she directed her senses. Castabello slowly and steadily walked up to a brown coffin. Then he quickly flung it open. The ghostly white flesh of a recently deceased man rested motionlessly. Whether it was an ordinary dead body or a sleeping vampire, they couldn't be certain. This was New York, and above-ground crypts weren't as common as they were in New Orleans. The crypts in this cemetery were designed to temporarily hold the bodies of deceased loved ones until a proper in-the-ground burial could be held. To determine if a body was still human or had become a vampire, the agents used a handy method. They took out their smartphones and turned on the camera. If the body was seen through the lens of the phone, then it was an ordinary corpse. If, on the other hand, no body appeared on the phone, then they had themselves a blood-sucking vampire. Lydia raised her phone and pointed it towards the dead body. Castabello stood alert with a wooden stake in his right hand. She peered into the viewfinder of her phone and saw the pale-skinned, middle-aged man. He wasn't a vampire. She sighed in relief as her heart calmed down. That particular crypt was clear. As the rain eased, a gloomy fog began to set in. They were in the Hudson Valley, and it was not unusual for fog to settle in after a period of rain. The creepy fog rolled over the tombstones, and it enshrouded the crypts. A red fox called out in the distance. The pale fog in a cemetery is eerie on its own, but it's infinitely more eerie and unsettling when you're hunting for a vampire nest. It gave the atmosphere the classic monster movie feel, but this wasn't a movie. This was real. Marsh looked at Castabello and said, "Great. Fog again. Just what we needed. Why does it always have to be foggy when we're on the hunt?" Castabello shrugged his shoulders and answered, "I don't know. I actually like the fog. I find a certain comfort in it. Marsh rolled her eyes and replied, Okay, Vincent Price. Side by side, Castabello and Marsh walked up a slight hill towards the next crypt. The fog caused them to look like two mysterious figures passing through a mysterious world. The sun hadn't yet set for the day, but they didn't let their guard down, because they weren't certain if the clouds and fog offered the vampires enough protection to wander outside. If the horror of the Bat Cave incident had taught them anything, it was that vampires can be active in the day if they are protected from the sun. Their hearts accelerated as they slowed down before the entrance of the crypt. Castabello nodded at Marsh as he opened the door to the crypt. This crypt held no coffin. It was empty. Once again, their hearts returned to a more normal pace. The fog thickened as the two Moon Mist agents walked toward the neighboring crypt. Castabello briefly thought that he sensed the presence of danger or evil, but he dismissed it on account of the fact that his feelings were all out of whack. The doubt, guilt, sorrow, and depression that he had been feeling clouded his mind. His judgment had become as foggy as the ominous landscape that surrounded them. Once again, Castabello nodded at Marsh and then opened the door to the crypt. Marsh went inside first, and Castabello then followed. The fog also followed them inside of the spooky crypt. Their hearts raced again. This time, Marsh quickly opened the coffin as Castabello got his camera ready on his phone. A woman, around 30 years old, rested in the coffin. She had been very pretty. Her skin looked pale and smooth, but there was a disturbing hint of color. The color could have been attributed to the work of the mortician, but they wouldn't be sure until they checked the camera. Castabello took a heavy breath and pointed the camera at the young woman's corpse. The viewfinder was empty. Her body didn't show up in the camera. That meant that she cast no reflection in a mirror. Castabello yelled, "She's a vampire! Slay away! Repeat, slay away!" As Marsh whipped her wooden stake through the air, the vampire's eyes opened up. The undead fiend opened her mouth and hissed as her two sharp fangs glistened from the light of the flashlight. The stake crashed into the vampire's chest as blood sprayed onto the white walls. The tip of the stake had barely pierced the undead creature's heart. The vampire screeched in pain and fear as Marsh began to hammer the stake deeper into its heart. She wasn't going to stop until the stake went through the monster's heart. After 3 hard blows, the stake went all the way through the vampire's heart. Then, the undead body combusted in flames. Within several minutes, nothing but ashes remained. The fire had briefly burned incredibly hot as it intensely raged. Then, it went out as quickly as it had roared to life. The life of the fire had marked the final end of the vampire. While they had hoped to find an entire nest of vampires sleeping the sleep of the undead, it wasn't a total loss. They had at least slain one damned creature of the night. Additionally, they had seen the layout of the cemetery by the light of day, and that would aid their efforts come nightfall. Castabello and Marsh decided that they would return at nightfall. The reports that they had received strongly suggested that there was more than one vampire prowling this cemetery. Though their advantage was lost at night, they had a task that needed to be completed. Castabello and Marsh left to go clean themselves up and to grab something to eat. They returned at around 11 p.m. Since it was nighttime and they didn't expect to come across any living people at the cemetery, Castabello switched his clothes. He had traded his usual FBI attire for his Kaibo vestments. He dressed not for an investigation, but for battle. The fog continued to enshroud the graveyard, just as death had enshrouded the bodies that were laid to rest there. Some bodies, however, were not at rest. Some bodies had been cursed as foul vampires. Lydia Marsh and Cono Castabello wore headlamps upon their heads. She carried a crossbow and he held a stake in his right hand as he kept his left hand free to use his kaibo powers if need be. If the vampires were around, they would find the vampires, or the vampires would find them. As the moon mist agents walked through the dark and foggy graveyard, coyotes howled in the distance. The tension in the atmosphere was palpable. Castabello did his best to silence his doubts and suppress his fear. Vampires sense fear and anxiety. Those emotions, or the chemicals that cause them, are like catnip to a vampire. Walking around with depression, despair, anxiety, and fear is like chumming the water for these shark-like vampires. As Castabello and Marsh walked through the graveyard, they hadn't heard anything. It was dead silent. Suddenly, the sound of someone running was heard. Castabello and Marsh briefly looked at each other to affirm what each of them had heard. Then they moved their heads to shine their headlamps on the source of the sound. For an instant, they saw a dark silhouette rapidly move from left to right. They weren't able to keep the light on the figure. As they were focused on one area, the sound of someone running came from behind them. The agents whipped around and looked behind them. The beams of light from their headlamps frantically searched here and there. Still, they hadn't seen who or what was running in the graveyard. Marsh felt her heart thumping in her chest. Over the past few months, she had been on edge under normal conditions, but now she was under real duress. Her adrenaline pumped through her body. She had no intention of running. She was ready to fight, and she wanted to fight right now. Anger rose up in her like a sea monster rises from the sea. The sound of the pitter-patter of running feet came from the distance in all directions. The rushing footsteps drew closer. It sounded like they were being surrounded. Finally, the pale faces of their foes could be seen. Their dead, white skin blended in with the fog. These vile predators were on the hunt, and the agents were on the menu. There were 4 vampires, 1 man and 3 women. They snarled and growled as they began to close the circle around the 2 agents. Castabello raised his left hand, opened it, and then tightly closed it. He was trying to use his kaibo powers to choke the vampire from a safe distance. Something was wrong. It had no effect. Nothing happened. Castabello was shocked. Since he had learned to use these abilities, he had never failed to use them at will. The red-headed female vampire charged toward him. He opened his hand, kept it flat, with his fingers pointed to the sky. It resembled the typical motion to stop or hold still. Yet again, it had 0 effect. The red-haired vampire crashed into him. The force of her attack made him fall backward into an open grave. He was 6 feet under. He began to panic. The inability to use his kaibo powers was the last straw. He felt helpless and impotent. The red-haired vampire jumped into the open grave to finish Castabello off. His emotional meltdown excited her to the point of frenzy. As she lunged at Castabello, he screamed at the top of his lungs and violently drove the wooden stake into her body. He hadn't struck her heart, though. He had put the stake into her stomach, and he didn't care that he had missed the target. He was so filled with rage that he only cared about stabbing her again and again. He thrust the stake into her stomach 31 times. Each strike made the demonic creature scream and bleed. Finally, on the 32nd strike, he plunged the stake straight through her heart. The vampire exploded all over Castabello. Meanwhile, 3 vampires closed in on Marsh. She exhaled deeply, squeezed the trigger of the crossbow, and shot the male vampire right through the heart. His body spontaneously combusted. Marsh then pointed at the dark-haired female vampire and pulled the trigger. The wooden arrow hit the bullseye, and she too spontaneously combusted. In the blink of an eye, Marsh adjusted her sights onto the last remaining vampire and pulled the trigger. The arrow whistled through the air, but this time she missed. The vampire charged toward Marsh and knocked the crossbow out of her hands. The vampire then slapped Marsh with the back of her hand. The force knocked Marsh down to the muddy ground. Castabello tried to climb out of the grave, but he couldn't. Not only wasn't there anything to grab a solid hold of, but the grave was muddy. The more forceful he was in his attempts to climb his way out, the more he slipped. He knew that Marsh was in trouble, and he was unable to help her. Again, he felt powerless. His partner was fighting for her life, and there was nothing he could do to help. Dazed and with a bloody nose, Marsh began to pick herself up off of the ground. The vampire charged at her like a hellhound. As the vampire reached Marsh, Marsh used a judo move on the vamp. The move used the vamp's own speed, power, and momentum against it, and rolled it into the open grave. Castabello locked his eyes on the falling vamp, and thrust his stake through its unholy ribcage as it was in mid-air. The last vamp exploded into bits and pieces. "Hey, Marsh, are you all right?" asked Castabello. "Yeah, I'll live. How are you?" an exhausted Marsh asked. "Well, I'm down in a grave," replied Castabello. "Nothing to worry about then. Down in a grave, nothing matters," said Marsh with a delirious chuckle. "Maybe so, but I'm not ready to make this my permanent residence quite yet. So, give me a hand and get me out of this bloody pit," said Castabello as he wiped vampire remains out of his hair. Marsh found some rope and got him out of the muddy grave. Exhausted, they both laid in the graveyard for half an hour and laughed at the fog. Late that night, Cono Castabello wrote the following poem by the light of the fireplace in his home. Down in a grave, doesn't matter if you were brave. Down in a grave, doesn't matter what you gave. Down in a grave, there's no one to save. Down in a grave, nothing matters. In the eternal dank dark grave, no escape from this solitary cave. Forever inundated by a dark wave. Light cannot penetrate the abyss. Comfort in sadness you miss. Why am I here, crippled with fear, the loss of those that you hold dear? Why am I here? Evil is near. Dead alive, never to thrive. Down in a grave, doesn't matter if you were brave. Down in a grave, doesn't matter what you gave. Down in a grave, there's no one to save. Down in a grave, nothing matters. Ancient fog of war and death, for the living there is no rest. Fight and fight till your last breath. Never give up, surpass the test. When you no longer care, look up for the flare. In the brightness of hope, I'll meet you there. Pit of gloom, pit of despair, cannot swallow love that is shared. I hope that you enjoyed your stay here at the haunted Half Moon Inn. The Master requests that you consider supporting me and the inn by becoming a a patron of mine on Patreon. The Half Moon Inn needs your support to keep the doors open. You wouldn't want the residents here to feel forgotten and abandoned, would you? Creating quality scary stories to share with you is very important to me. Running this inn of horror is a passion of mine, and I would truly appreciate your support. The world is hurting. It needs more horror. Help me to heal the world through horror. Together, with your help, we could haunt this world one home at a time. Until next time, always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.